floods, fires, earthquakes, violence, terrorism. According to scholastic author Jennifer Fink, by the age of 16, 1 out of every 4 children will have directly experienced some sort of trauma. With today's media saturation, even faraway tragedies can cause anxiety and worry in our students. To fully understand the impact of disaster stories on children, we must consider the purpose, the need, the benefit, the development, and the application in our schools. Let's start with the purpose. Is it turned on? So as we do a technical fix here, thank you, Professor Colley. Starting with the purpose. There are several purposes for using disaster stories with children. Storytelling and or literature can be used to inform students. It's a springboard for learning. Disasters create excitement by playing out fears during uncontrollable events. We often see children portray their fears during play. When kids experience trauma, often when they're playing, you'll see them in their storytelling talking about the trauma or the disaster that occurred. The stories symbolize the helplessness that is often felt. It displays the fears that we often feel. They portray leaders and heroes helping individuals. And they provide an outlet to cope with unexpected and significant events. Disasters come in a variety of forms, and stories help define these forms. Stories tell of terrible events and how people cope with them. One type of disaster is natural disasters, and these are naturally occurring phenomena. Kids are very interested and intrigued by natural disasters. We have tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, avalanches, and landslides. We can use stories to help not only help them cope with natural disasters if they've been involved in one, but also to inform them because they're very curious about them. Cooper Finds a Family is just a heartfelt story about a dog's survival during Hurricane Katrina. Another disaster is terrorist attacks, and these are surprise attacks involving deliberate use of violence against civilians. Salmonella attacks, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, the Oklahoma City Federal Building bombing, the World Trade Center bombing, 9/11, and then soon after the anthrax letter attacks. As a small child, I don't ever recall being afraid of terrorism. I don't recall watching the news or reading the newspapers about terrorist attacks. benefits of using disaster stories. There's power in storytelling and in the written word. And stories provide a vehicle for discussion and a tool to help children cope. Before moving forward, I'd also like to tell you about another disaster, and that is violence. And children see violence. And this is when there's physical force intended to damage or kill someone or something. And there are several types of violence. One is psychological violence, and that's our students are verbally abused, often by their own parents. And so using books and stories can help the children. There's also physical violence, and that is violence when it's either physical or sexual abuse. And then finally, violence in schools. Our kids are afraid to go to school because our parents are afraid to send their kids to school. After Sandy Hook, many of our parents were afraid and the kids were scared. I remember being at school, I remember the meetings, I remember talking about how are we going to explain this to children, how are we going to help them. There's a great book called A Terrible Thing Happened, and it's a story about a little raccoon named Sherman, and Sherman saw something violent happen, and he's very confused by what happened. His stomach starts to hurt, he starts to have bad dreams, and then at school, he starts to get in trouble because he doesn't know how to react. And it isn't until Miss Maple comes along and Miss Maple helps Sherman talk about his problems. It doesn't say what the particular problem is, but the kids can relate it to any of their problems and use that story to help them. Tragedies can create feelings of anxiety and fear in children, even far away tragedies. Stories provide reassurance and equip students with knowledge. They bring comfort to children in these distress situations. They examine moral choices and they acknowledge anxieties. During times of disaster, people are really faced with morality choices. Some take the higher ground and they are heroes and they are out there and they are helping people. Some people with that morality faced and really being pushed to the limit, they start looting or they resort to violence. And so kids can examine these moral choices through the stories and the literature. We now understand the need and the benefit, but how does the development of a disaster story advance? The development of the story includes specific characteristics. Ordinary events occur. There is an indication of harmful events on their way. The hero attempts to inform. The disaster strikes. The hero commands the situation, and then life is forever altered. In these stories, the characters are often children, animals, or objects. And the villain is actually the event itself. I want you to look for these characteristics as I share a story of friendship and survival. The city of New Orleans, the powerful Mississippi. The fresh smell of warm beignets, Mardi Gras, jazz. The city is bustling with life day and night. But on August 25th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina bore down on the city and everyone who lived there, threatening human nature and showing the very worst side of mankind. Winds roared 110 miles an hour. The rain pounded down. The storm pushed on the walls, breaking the levees, causing the rain and waters to pour into the city of New Orleans. People who thought they could weather the storm were now forced to leave their homes, and many had to abandon their animals. Bobby had been left behind. He had been chained and attached to a chain and left in the house where he couldn't move. Bobcat, his faithful friend, was also abandoned, but he stayed with his friend, and together, in the silent heat, they weathered the storm. In the days that followed Hurricane Katrina, people from all over the world came to offer help. They rescued people off of the roofs of their home, and they rescued animals that had been abandoned. But Bobby and Bobcat, in the confusion, no one came to rescue them. No one came to get them. They had been left behind, and Bobby was attached to this chain. Eventually they ran out of food, they ran out of water, and Bobby did the only thing he could do. He yanked on that chain, and he detached himself. And the two of them, Bobby with his faithful friend Bobcat close behind, they went into the streets of New Orleans, into the oily waters, into the buckled streets, and they searched for food. But during this time, it was very dangerous. There were bigger animals, there were packs of animals, and it was really hard for smaller animals to get food. This was the fit for the survival, every man for themselves, and it was very difficult for them to get food. Bobby, at one point his ribs were starting to show, and Bobcat, who was this beautiful sugar coating, was now a very dull white color. In January, this is 4 months after Hurricane Katrina, the two animals wandered upon a construction site. And there was a man named Rich who saw the two animals and saw they were so hungry. And so he started feeding Bobby and Bobcat. He noticed the chain around Bobby, but he noticed that Bobcat really liked that chain, so he trimmed it down a little bit, but he didn't cut it completely off. He also noticed that Bobby would get very upset if anybody touched Bobcat. Nobody could touch his little friend. Well, one day the construction site manager came on site, saw the animals, and said, "Oh no, no way, this dog, this cat, out of here, they gotta go." So Rich grabbed some food with Bobby and Bobcat close behind, moved the food into his car, and the two animals jumped in the car. He brought them to a temporary shelter, and when they arrived at the shelter, they put dogs on one side, cats on the other side, and separated the two friends. Well, Bobby was very upset. He was not going to have it, and he caused a ruckus that night. He barked and he howled, and he barked and he howled, and he didn't let anybody sleep because he wanted to be with his friends. Well, eventually, the volunteers had enough. Nobody could sleep, nobody could rest. So they said, "You know what, just put that dog in a bigger cage, get the cat's crate, put the crate inside of the cage, and just let them be together." So they did that. They got a bigger cage, they got the crate, they put the crate inside the cage, and the two were together. But that wasn't good enough for Bobby and Bobcat, because they wanted to be together. So they opened up the crate, and they let Bobcat out, and he went over to his friend, and they snuggled their little nose together, and they were happy. All the volunteers were intrigued by these two animals, and one volunteer noticed that when Bobcat walked, he walked very carefully as if he was going to step on something. So the volunteer went up to Bobcat and waved his hand in front of Bobcat, and he didn't flinch. Waved his hand again, and Bobcat didn't move. Bobcat was blind. This entire time, Bobby had been Bobcat's seeing eye dog. You see, Bobcat had stayed right next to his friend Bobby the whole time as a loyal friend, but Bobby had helped his friend by being his seeing eye dog. The temporary shelter was closing, and the two animals had no home, and so they made an attempt to go out and to find the owners of these two pets. So they went on Anderson Cooper 360 on CNN, and they made a plea out for the owners to come forward that they had their pets. Well, the owners never did come forward,